Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. It's a session B, change in US-Turkey relations and its impact on South Caucasus. It's frankly terrifying to see so many people interested in this, but speak louder. Is that better? It's still frankly terrifying to see so many of you. We'll be starting very shortly indeed. Greetings again. I suppose we can start now. As I already said, it's a session about the change between Turkey and US relations and its impact for South Caucasus. It's quite a multifaceted topic with major international actors involved in it, Russia, Iran, NATO. But before we go to discussing it, actually, let me introduce my esteemed speakers. On the left is Richard Giragosian, Director of Regional Studies Center, and on the right is Osman Sert. Yes. Is that right? Good. Research Director, Ankara Institute, Turkey. So, what I noticed when I read the description of our session is that maybe a bit overly diplomatic tone when it comes to description of the relations between US and Turkey. It's changed, and we have quite a peculiar word, decoupling. And if you look at the international press, pretty much everyone sums it up as deterioration. So let's start with commenting on that. If Mr. Giragosian could sum up briefly, what are the main reasons behind this, maybe not so recent deterioration, but it's quite evident still?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'd like to begin with a somewhat non-traditional attempt at framing the narrative in terms of looking at the broader perspective. And in many ways, in order to frame the narrative, I'm going to ask you to imagine a country with 5 unique characteristics. Imagine a country deeply polarized over a decisive but divisive leader. Imagine a country with a democratically elected president governing the country with a legitimacy resembling a cult of personality. Imagine a country with a president who denounces the opposition as traitors or terrorists. And imagine a country where individual power undermines institutional oversight, with the rule of law resembling the law of the ruler. And finally, imagine a country with a president who surrounds himself with a small circle of loyal, submissive advisors and family members. Obviously, I'm talking about the United States, but I'm also talking about Turkey. And to a degree, I'm talking about Russia and Azerbaijan. But this country that we imagine represents a pivotal position in terms of regional security and stability in the South Caucasus. But if we look at changing US-Turkish relations, I would argue the implications for the South Caucasus are present, are concerning, are worrisome, but it is actually Turkish-Russian relations that is much more significant and profound in terms of the impact on the South Caucasus. At the same time, this is the 10th anniversary of the European Union's Eastern Partnership. However, we are greatly worried about the Western Partnership, about commitments to long-standing Western institutions. Ukraine continues to be a test of Western resolve and commitment, but the South Caucasus as well is in a dynamic period of flux or change. But I do want to stress an opportunity regarding Turkey. There is a specific opportunity for Turkey to play a more positive and more profound role in the South Caucasus. There are 5 specific drivers for welcoming Turkey's role in the region. The first is the geopolitical. The relationship between Ankara and Moscow could be a positive contributor to normalization with Armenia, reopening the closed border, and not necessarily a zero-sum game. Beyond the geopolitical, there's also an economic imperative for Turkey in search of new markets and new credit to actually look at the South Caucasus as more than simply Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Rather, the closed border between Turkey and Armenia is also a border between Turkey and the Eurasian Economic Union. Beyond geopolitics and economics, there's a national security consideration for Turkey to stabilize the east of Turkey, to counter the PKK and the Kurdish insurgency with jobs and economic answers, more than simply relying on military response. And normalization with Armenia, for example, would be a game changer in a region that knows few positive game changers. Moreover, it would represent a rare success for Turkish foreign policy. And finally, it would be the path to regaining Turkish power and influence in the region in a positive contribution. And in conclusion, there is no conclusion. This is a dynamic, not static process. Thank you.
Excellent. And if I may move to you with the first question, we have here flexible alliances of Turkey with Russia and Iran, and flexible alliances is in quotation marks. If you could comment on those alliances, and also your take why there was a need for quotation marks in there.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure that I will be precise, short, as Richard did, since the issue is Turkey, I request a bit longer time to express it. I want to change the question. How do Turkey's relations with the United States shape its flexible alliances with Russia and Iran? Because it is being perceived as if Turkey has some relations with Iran and Russia, and it is changing its relations with the United States. I think vice versa, because especially there are some reasons why Turkey developed this relation with Russia and Iran, especially regarding Russia, regarding Syria. Turkey faced with an American administration, it is not taking into consideration the Turkey's concerns into account. And I don't want to put all the blame on the shoulders of the Trump administration. It started with the Obama administration. I remember very well when the Assad regime perpetrated some chemical attacks on Damascus, on Ghouta. He was speaking, Mr. President Obama speaking at the Rose Garden with a sunny DC day with his vice president, and he said that I made a decision. The Syrian administration crossed my red lines. And then he said another thing, I made another decision. I will ask this to the Congress. He shouldn't ask to the Congress to take any measure. And Turkey was already ready to contribute to any kind of American mission to control the Assad regime. The Turkish Turkish government said that they are ready to attend to join coalitions of willing. Indeed, the Turkish government should ask this to its parliament. And they committed itself to such kind of a mission without asking the parliament, and that's why the opposition criticized the government severely. But the American administration, they shouldn't ask the Congress, but they did it. And this disappointment created a very breaking point for Turkey regarding the Syrian thing, on how much they can trust in the Americans. And second thing is the YPG-PKK issue. The American administration insisted to disregard, underestimate the importance of YPG-PKK security threat to Turkey coming from Syria. And and the third one is the July 15, the coup attempt in Turkey, which was perpetrated by the FETÖ Gülenist, terror organization, and its leader is being just given a safe haven in the United States. If you just put all these together, it created a confidence problem in Turkey, in the eyes of Turkey. It is not only, especially the coup attempt, it is a frustrating, a very difficult time for Turkey, and unfortunately foreigners didn't understand the importance of this trauma which created on the Turkish public and the Turkish government. And the S-400 decision mainly came after this trauma, and the Americans just waited to see who will win this fight at this night against the elected government indeed. And then this pushed Turkey to Russia. From my point of view, the relations with Russia is conjunctural and temporary. It is not a structural alliance. Yes, alliance is a very sexy word, but it is too ambitious to define Turkish-Russian relations, Turkish-Iranian relations as alliance. We can define it as rapprochement, as cooperation, as some other definitions, but not as alliance. And that's why. Just I want to touch upon the S-400 thing, because most probably there will be some questions on it. Turkey is in need of a missile defense system for a very long time. During Saddam issue as well, Turkey was without any protection against Scud missiles of Saddam Hussein. And then right after what happened in Syria, Turkey got away severely that it has no missile defense system, especially any kind of chemical missile attack will be coming from Syria. And that's why it just go into some search for it. And again, it didn't find some ears ready to listen to Turkey's concerns in DC as well. And though still, I don't think that the S-400 decision is a well-planned, well-counted decision, but at the end of the day, this is the psychology which created such kind of a decision. And we are seeing some reports that there are some bargainings continuing between Turkey, United States, and Russia especially. I think the main question in Turkey right now is not how to handle the crisis with the United States if S-400 will be initiated, operationalized in Turkey. But the main question is how Turkey can convince Russia if it gives up the decision, because it will have a cost as well. And that's why to manage the Russians will be so important. And that's why this is the main reason of deadlock. And today there was a report that a Turkish official and unnamed Turkish officials just denied that Turkey is still bound by the agreement with Russians. I don't think it is just a coincidence after the telephone conversation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan yesterday night. And that's why I'm taking this into consideration. And Russia already started to push Turkey not to move away from this S-400 decision in Idlib. Okay, it is. I'm seeing this, push, just attacking the very close points to Turkish forces in Syria. You should stay there. You shouldn't change your decision S-400. I wanted to put my emphasis on Russia. Why? Because during the whole day yesterday, I have listened here. Just Russia was the main problem in this region, at least main cause of concern, if not problem. And that's why I want to put my focus generally on Russian thing. I will just reply the other questions. Just regarding the South Caucasus, I will touch just a bit on it, that the Americans and the Turks are on the same page on South Caucasus. Regarding decoupling, I will just leave it to the second round. Still, in South Caucasus, the Americans and Turks are still on the same page. There's no decoupling or differentiation on policies, but the problem is that, which is valid for Washington and Ankara at the same time, is that for both governments, administrations, South Caucasus is not at the focus. It is not at the top of the agenda. This is the problem for this region, I think. I want to stop here with this, the other questions, we can continue. Thank you so much.
We may as well go home then if it's not the focus. But before I go back to you, I would like to inquire a bit more about you didn't want to call it an alliance. Let's call it a relationship between Turkey and Russia. How much equal partners are they? How much Turkey can act on its own free will? And also on S-400 issue, I think you'll find lots of arguments saying that US was offering a counter deal to that purchase, and Turkey did not take it. What do you think was the reason?
I have question marks whether the Americans are giving a counter and as valuable as offer to Turkey, because I'm remembering the NATO missile shield negotiations. Turkey pushed too much for these negotiations because if Turkey didn't insist too much, the NATO missile shield was leaving maybe 2/3 of Turkey out of protection. And there were so many disappointments regarding NATO's and the Americans' will to protect Turkey. If you look at these Jupiter missile things, when the crisis with Russia on Cuba, just the NATO, the American missiles was withdrawn from Turkey, and just tell to the Turkish governments that no, they are staying over there, we will just protect you with submarines. There are so many things, and that's why there are enough base for Turks not to trust enough to NATO alliance and Turkey. Suppose that on Crimea, it's the loss for Turkey as well. If Turkey takes an action on Crimea, how much do you think the NATO will be just supporting the NATO in any way? There are really some questions. On the equal relations, Turkey managed to have equal relations with Russia. You need to talk to Russians with the same eye level. For instance, I don't remember the exact time, it will be 2011 or 2012 maybe. Turkey landed a Russian airplane to Ankara, which was carrying some military stuff to Syria. Turkey said that you shouldn't do this, with notifications, with diplomatic means, but Russia insisted, and Turkey landed a Russian plane to Ankara, and nothing changed. Putin visited Istanbul again. Turkey can manage to have equal relations with Russia. But the problem is that if your allies, the Americans, the Europeans, are leaving you alone with Russia, then it is changing the balance. It is something obvious. Okay, and that is, and just, I don't want to just forget the Iranian thing. The relations with Iran, again, it is not, I think, an alliance. But the problem is that, especially the existing American administration is moving with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in the region. And they are pushing Iran to corner. Turkey never wants any country in the region to be cornered. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or whatever it is, okay? Because this region, all actors, if you corner one, they will jump into the picture with some, sudden, explosions or some, some other means to the picture. And Turkey doesn't want Iran to be cornered. And this is another question. Suppose that Iran was just erased from the political picture. Who will be next? For the Americans, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Turkey knows this. And that's why, and this is not, an alliance, but the American policies are pushing Turkey for, and another thing regarding decoupling of Turkish-US relations. I don't think that only the US-Turkish relations are decoupling. What about the relations with the European Union and the Americans? It means that the Europeans are decoupling with the Americans as well. And that's why Turkey needs to change, needs to update, needs to rethink its policies if its most important ally is changing its policies in the region about its main alliances, the NATO alliance, and accordingly it's trying to adapt itself to the realities on the ground, and it's a result of a very realistic, I think, policy. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the cooperation with Russians will provide Turkey with the all result that Turkey wanted, because there's a saying in Turkish: if you give your hand, you will lose your arm. That let's just change it a bit for the Russians. If you give your hands, you will lose your body. I think that is the problem. Thank you.
Excellent, and I think the general opinion that Turkey is being pushed to things that it's doing with Russia and Iran. I think there will be some opinions, some people here who will contest that, so we will leave that to audience questions. Getting back to you, I could not help but notice quite a big pink-colored elephant in your speech in the room, because you spoke about all the positive change that Russia-Turkey relationship could bring. What about the possible challenges and risks that kind of partnership and double team could pose?
Thank you. From an Armenian perspective, what's most interesting is Historically, when Russia and Turkey were in alignment, if not alliance, we've always suffered. Georgia has always suffered from such an alignment as well. But I do think that Russia is generally in a position of weakness, not strength, a position of insecurity, not confidence. And moreover, I agree with my Turkish colleague, the current situation between Moscow and Ankara is the aberration, not the norm. These are historically rivals, and in many ways, Russia is simply manipulating the needs and the situation. But from an Armenian perspective, what's most interesting is our country has a new advantage. It's a rare commodity called legitimacy, based on free and fair elections. In addition, we have also acquired what is an endangered species in this region, political will. And I do think that overall, the current stalemate between the republics of Armenia and Turkey is also an aberration. And it is only a question of when, but no longer if, the border reopens and diplomatic relations are restored. What we see, however, though, is from an American perspective. Having served in Washington, I was for 10 years in the United States Senate, I must stress as a Democrat, and in many ways, the South Caucasus is not a strategic priority for the Americans, nor has it been for several administrations. The South Caucasus is, for the United States, a subset of US-Russian relations. It is also partly about Iran and partly about Turkey. But unfortunately, or currently, fortunately, the US has been absent, AWOL. It is withdrawing from the region. It is leaving a dangerous vacuum, however, in terms of security and stability. And it has been Russia that is filling this vacuum. So the outlook is not as optimistic as I would argue, but our aspirations, especially given the change of government in Armenia, where we do stand as a partner for peace. And we do expect and can actually guarantee a significant improvement in relations with all our neighbors. And let's not underestimate the importance of Georgia. Georgia is not only an intermediary, but Georgia has the most to lose from any conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Georgia has the most to lose and the higher price to pay in the event of renewed hostilities over Nagorno-Karabakh. Georgia should actually pay more attention to the promise of Armenia-Turkey normalization, and Georgia should actually do a little bit more to leverage its role as a broker as well as a host.
Excellent, and thank you. And since we don't have a person here who could provide a Georgian perspective on that, I'll be so bold and take the mantle up. What I think is a very nightmarish situation, a scenario for a regular Georgian citizen, is to think that Russia and Turkey would kind of, let's use the kindergarten terms, and team up and to see Turkey adopt the same kind of policies, same kind of strategies, and same kind of tactics as Turkey does. That's what frightens us at nights. That's what really scares us when we read about another agreement between Russia and Turkey. That's what concerns us when we see President Erdogan calling Mr. Putin my dear friend Vladimir and so on. But let's go back to confrontation between the Turkey and the overall West before we discuss the NATO. And I think leaving aside all this S-400 and geopolitical conundrum, I think the confrontation is also somewhat value-based. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, considering what we've seen in later years between the rhetorics and narratives between the Western states, mostly Western liberal states, and what Turkey has to counter them with. It's also quite a value-heavy argument going on.
Just before that, I want to talk about the nightmares of the Georgians. Yes, Turkey has very close relations with Russia, but it doesn't mean that all policies are being shaped by the Russian interests. In Turkey, regarding Georgia, it is a Turkish interest as well to keep the Russian influence away from its border, and that's why the Georgian autonomy, Georgian independence is so important for Turkey as well. Regarding Abkhazia, South Ossetia, so Turkey has some historical, links to this region, and that's why I don't share. I understand, but don't share this, nightmare at least. And if you look at the Turkish-Russian relations. All issues, Russia and Turkey are the other sides of the table, regarding Armenia, regarding Cyprus, regarding the influence on Eastern Mediterranean, about the relations with Iran, whatever it is. The Russia and Turkey has much uncommon things indeed. But the reality is, especially the real imminent security threat in Syria. More than 3 million refugees are inside Turkey right now. And in Idlib, there are 3 million Syrians just waiting over there. And it's a risk. And how can you think that Turkey shouldn't take this big risk into consideration? I'm sometimes not laughing, but also crying that some European countries are making some ceremonies that we will be accepting 273 refugees. Come on. More than 3 million refugees are living in Turkey right now, and what's happening in Syria is so crucial. Regarding the alliances and the West, who is West? What is West? What is the European Union? We know that what the United Kingdom is just having an identity crisis, and then the relations with the Americans and the Europeans, and that's why we should think what is the West again. Always Turkey is being perceived as if it is living under an oxygen tent. It is just, everything is constant, just Turkey is changing. It is not, the international system is changing. Still, during the Cold War, the relations between the Americans and the Turkey was defined, but now it is not. It is independent from who is ruling the American, the White House and Turkey. It is still the relations between the West and Turkey, the NATO alliance, it is still not defined. Who is the common enemy? For the countries, who is the common enemy? Okay, the Assad regime, now we are seeing that the Obama administration was dealing with Russians to keep Assad in power. And that's why we should rethink about this. I don't want to escape the question about the values. You're right. There's a problem on that. There's a problem on, press freedom. There's the problem of plurality. There's a problem of, concentration of power in one hand. Nobody can escape from this. But if you just look at the issue from both perspectives, I am repeating that just with, whenever just I am lucky to catch too many people here, just not in the smaller room. 15th of July coup attempt, which was perpetrated by the FETÖ. Think about that. Your own airplanes are shooting your parliaments. Your military aircrafts, helicopters are killing in the streets of your capital, at the Bosphorus Bridge. The tanks are shelling your own citizens. And the Europeans, just leaving Mr. Tusk and Mr. Juncker, they made a very bold explanations right after this coup attempt, but the single European countries, the Americans, they were just sit and wait who will win this. And that's why there's a very big problem of confidence in the Turkish public, not only in just whenever just we are making some ballots and and none of the parties have a confidence in the United States or the West, and that is why please do not try to see what's happening in Turkey just from a one-party, one-man issue or something like that. This is much more complicated than that. And finally, I think the alliances will stay there. Turkey will stay as a NATO member. Turkey will keep the track on the EU affair. I know that it's very problematic. For decades it's continuing, but it is, even President Erdogan just told that they are stick to the EU thing, and there are some criteria left for the visa liberalization, visa-free travel to European Union. And that's why this main direction is not so easy to change for Turkey. But it should be renewed, it should be, adapted to the new conditions. And now, even today in Turkey, there are some pluralistic, discussions on what is going on in Turkey, in which direction is going. And I think that still there is a very healthy democracy in Turkey, and it will shape the future of Turkey. Thank you.
Excellent. And Mr. Sert raised a very interesting opinion that the relationship between the US and Turkey is not in any way defined or shaped by the men who are in charge. And do you think do you share that opinion?
I would argue precisely the opposite. In terms of the triangle, the triad of relations between Presidents Trump, Erdogan, and Putin, these men share a dangerously severe amount of a shared worldview. They have too much in common. In many ways, this is titanic egos at play. Middle-aged men in their own identity crises, each with a rather combination of political street smarts and charisma, mixed with a dangerous temptation to rule the country, not to govern the country. And what's interesting for me, the contrast in this region, I come from Armenia. We're usually 2 steps behind Georgia. Despite the rivalry between Yerevan and Tbilisi, we don't like to admit the fact that we emulate and look up to Georgian accomplishments in democratization, despite the recent setbacks in Georgian politics. But why this is important is also because Armenia has graduated from a previous generation. In other words, the Prime Minister of Armenia is 43 years old, and he's the oldest member of his cabinet. This is a demographic shift. And to be honest, from an analytical point of view, the future of this region are not people of my generation. They are sitting in the audience. They are the young generation that represents the future and now the present of our countries. And unfortunately, Azerbaijan is somewhat excluded from this calculus. But if we look at Turkey and Russia and the United States, all 3 countries respect strength, not weakness. And in dealing with Turkey and dealing with Russia, it is strength that matters. Any sign of weakness or submission is exploited. But if we look forward, the reason I'm justifiably optimistic is the error of authoritarian rule, the era and the error, is now painfully obvious. There is no way to restore the previously unacceptable status quo. Denying the voters and the population more of a voice and choice is no longer sustainable. And unfortunately, not because of Trump, but despite Trump, I am still optimistic that the one lesson from Georgia, if we look at Saakashvili, individual Democrats are important, but democratic institutions are more important. And the erosion of institutional democracy in the United States, in Turkey and Russia is a grave concern. But our real self-sufficiency in Armenia and in Georgia is the key to true and durable security and stability. And this is what we're investing in. And again, the demographic change, if we look at the demographics of Iran as well, this is a turning point. We won't realize the significance as a tipping point until the change is more profound.
To my shame, I just realized we did not speak to talk about Iran at all, almost, and let's remedy that mistake, or not enough. So if both of you could quickly sum up the role of Iran in this paradigm of triangle.
Let me go first, especially because it's an opportunity to warn of the danger of the romanticizing of a war culture in Washington. We see, as we had Cheney and the earlier Bush administration, the grave mistake of an invasion of Iraq, now being repeated from a similar set of neocons, if you will. Unfortunately, the United States generally always needs or wants an enemy, whether it's Gaddafi, whether it's Khomeini. In other words, unfortunately, the power politics is such that the Americans tend to either empower enemies or find them when they lack them. What this means also in terms of going forward, Iran in many ways shares a similar set of interests with Armenia. Both countries are threatened by isolation and insignificance. And it's very dangerous to push Iran into a corner with nowhere to go. The European negotiated Western deal over the nuclear program with Iran was a historic achievement. And much to the credit of both Iran and the West, it was a reasonable way forward. It is now Trump that is the real threat to regional security and stability, not Iran. But unfortunately, we may pay a price for an increasingly dangerous escalation. And unfortunately, in terms of geopolitics, the militant voices have overtaken the moderate voices. It's our burden and responsibility to attempt to regain and restore a sense of normalcy. Hence, my position regarding Turkey is soft, is moderate, does not reflect Armenian public opinion. In Armenia, there is a sense that despite the protocols of normalization, Turkey walked away. I would argue, however, that it was never supposed to be easy and never supposed to be fast. The Armenian government, similar to the last Armenian government, maintains a policy of no preconditions. We're looking to normalize relations. Normalization is not reconciliation, but it's a step in the right direction. But for Iran, for Georgia, Armenia-Turkey normalization is one of the rare positive game changers that can also influence the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We heard yesterday about climate change and the security aspects. I would argue we also need another kind of climate change. We need a new environment that's more conducive to conflict resolution, dialogue, diplomacy, over force of arms.
Thank you. And if we have Azeri attendants, yeah, I'll just get back to you shortly. If we have Azeri attendants here in the audience, we would very much be interested in your take on Mr. Giragosian's opinion. Regarding Iran, let me ask you a slightly different question. This marriage of convenience between Turkey and Iran, how long do you envisage it's going to last, and what kind of changes can it bring to the region in general?
Just you know, especially the American attitude probably will be decisive about the Turkish-Iranian relations. But of course, Turkey and Iran is in the region for centuries, just before the America existed. But what bringing Turkey and Iran together is not common interests, but mainly the common concerns and common threats, and this is bringing Iran and Turkey together. And but Iran is so influential in the region. I don't think maybe it is I'm borrowing it from Wali Nasser with asymmetric strike, low cost, efficient, and costing millions of lives in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in other region. And Iran is not hesitating to put danger the lives of the people in the region, but this engagement is not a solution to solve this problem. And whenever Turkey is just giving its hands to Iran, if you look at the last 15 years and its relations with its neighbors, when Turkey was just giving a hand to Syria, there was a counterpart over there, and the Turkish-Syrian relations was great. When the Turks was giving hand to Kurds, the relations was happening very good. But whenever you are giving a hand to Iranians, sometimes this hand was left empty. Iran has a historical distance to the cooperation with Turkey, and that's why we need to keep this in mind. Regarding this Turkish-Armenian normalization process, and Turkey walked away. First of all, who initiated this normalization? I wonder whether Turkey pushed Armenia for normalization, or the Armenia pulled Turkey for normalization. I think the first one. I remember very well how Mr. Nalbantian was scared to be the man who is signing a treaty with a Turkish foreign minister for normalization in Zurich. It was, Turkey did too much to push Armenia for normalization, but nobody can disregard the fact of Azerbaijan in the region and the Nagorno-Karabakh thing. If some positive things happens in Nagorno-Karabakh, yes, and accordingly something can happen for the Turkish-Armenian border as well, and I wish it happened.
Excellent. And let's cover the last subject on our agenda, the NATO. And let me ask you, does Turkey has the luxury of risk its role and put it at stake in NATO?
The short answer is no. I do think no matter what happens through the ups and downs, Turkey will remain a contributor and an active member of the NATO alliance. To me, I'm an analyst. I'm not an expert on anything. But as an analyst, I think the bigger threat to NATO and the alliance is the unpredictability of the Americans, not the Turks. But in many ways, I think NATO is probably in danger of renewal. It is unfortunately being tested just as the European Union is being tested by the governments in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and especially Hungary, where there was an embarrassing White House visit recently where Donald Trump again signaled his devotion to authoritarianism and intolerance, etc. Therefore, I do think the underlying problem of NATO fragmenting, fracturing, is more coming from Washington, not Ankara. But at the same time, I do think that the NATO alliance in and of itself is also a reflection of a past security system. We need actually to address new threats with new security approaches. Hence, much of this conference was over so-called hybrid threats. It is hybrid threats that is the new norm of threats.
Excellent. And speaking of hybrid threats and also sharing the Georgian perspective on things, that exactly would be one of the tools for disinformation campaigns here. If Turkey was to somehow deteriorate its relations with NATO further, there will be people with anti-Western narratives who would say, look what's happening. But going back to you, I think I'm quite sure you would agree with the gist of the argument that Mr. Giragosian has shared, that Washington is to be blamed with the Turkey-NATO deterioration. But if you have anything to add before we go to the questions from the audience, be my guest.
Just as I have mentioned already that the NATO alliance is so important for Turkey, and we should accept that, Turkey has the only veto power in NATO. Not in the United Nations, not in the European Union, not any other international organization. But this is the most, in spite of all its problems, in spite of all, there are so many things to define for NATO, what is the mission of it, but still it is the most functional, strong military alliance in the globe, and Turkey has a veto power over that, and I don't think that it is an alternative for Turkey to leave it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you both. And now we are ready to get questions from the audience. Feel free. Nobody told me that. Well, this is the provocative one. The U.S. canceled the already? The US canceled the F-35 deal with Turkey because of the S-400. Should Ankara cancel the deal with Russia, apologize to the US, or get some Chinese G20s instead?
Apologize the US. This is not some diplomatic words, okay? Maybe Turkey should revise its policies, should rethink how to get S-400 or how to initiate it. But, apologizing for some security matters. Turkey has a security concern to protect itself against any kind of missile threat. But I think this process is already happening in Ankara, that I think a middle way is being searched over there, how to manage the crisis. Because if you take into consideration the Turkish economic, the economic crisis now is happening, it is just hurting the Turkish public as well. And Katsa, the economic sanctions are just being discussed. If S-400 is in Turkey, Turkey should take this into consideration. But a middle way should be found. But, apologizing, just forget about it.
Another stinging one for you. Where exactly can be this healthy democracy found in Turkey with recent Istanbul elections recount?
I was waiting who will ask this Istanbul elections. First of all, we should accept that I was in DC and listening 5 Turks speaking in English about the Turkish democracy and Turkish elections, and all of them was, except one gentleman, just defending that the existing government is stealing votes and there's fraud in the elections, and that's why anytime the opposition won't be able to win the elections, it's falsified. If opposition, the Turkish public is changing its mind, and in Ankara, in some very important cities, it's changed. Regarding Istanbul, the margin is too little, just more than 10,000 votes. And the decision of High Commission for Elections is controversial and not convincing for the Turkish public. And that's why there is a reaction in the public regarding rerun for the Istanbul elections. I cannot predict what will happen, but I can say truly that it will be very difficult for all parties to win the hearts of the Istanbul people. But even still, we should see that still we are discussing the ballot box. We are still discussing the elections. And this is important thing I think I need to underline. Thank you.
Excellent. And there is another question for both of you, is what should or could new Armenian government do to build a new process with Turkey, and will Ankara be interested, or do they have no time for Armenia at the moment? I think we should start.
What's interesting is there is a new opportunity with the free and fair elections in Armenia recently for a new parliament, with a new, more democratic government. As I stressed before, we've acquired a degree of greater legitimacy, which translates into greater political will. The third element we don't have yet, but we're seeking: statesmanship. Legitimacy and political will in and of themselves are important, but it's statesmanship in terms of becoming less a prisoner of the past and shaping a shared future. In terms of Armenia-Turkey, the current Armenian government is continuing the same policy of the previous government, a policy of no preconditions, where genocide recognition is no longer a prerequisite for simply normalizing relations. To be honest, we are waiting in Armenia. The issue of normalization with Turkey is simply not on the agenda in Ankara currently. They are distracted and they are overwhelmed by more pressing concerns. However, much of our effort is to sustain the momentum, to broaden the constituency for peace and normalization, and in many ways, to be ready. Our patience is not infinite, but there are gestures of goodwill that each side has done and will hopefully continue. Because in many ways, let's be honest, from a Georgian perspective or an Armenian perspective, neighbors are like your mother-in-law. You don't get to choose your mother-in-law. It comes with, depending on who your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, or partner is. In the case of Armenia, to be honest, we don't choose our neighbors. In the case of Georgia, we don't live in Switzerland. There is a Russian factor. From an Armenian perspective, I'm quite happy that we don't have a border with Russia. And in many ways, a closed border with Turkey is again abnormal. In the words of former Foreign Minister Davutoglu, what we're seeking to do is to normalize the abnormal. And I do think that it's a question, again, of when and no longer if. And most importantly, it was never supposed to be that quick or that easy. And there are both diplomatic and security dividends where, whether it's Armenia-Turkey normalization, it's a win-win. If we look at conflict resolution over Nagorno-Karabakh, it should be both win-win and lose-lose. Concession and compromise is the only way forward. Although trends in public opinion are dangerously moving in the wrong direction, we need our leaders to dare to shape public opinion and to lead their society to a more prosperous and cooperative future, rather than being locked in a past where that guy's military jacket is no longer cool, where the glorification of arms and the threat of arms is no longer the acceptable norm for diplomacy. But I'm still optimistic. I've moved to Armenia from Washington. Maybe I'm crazy, but I'm not a fool. I don't stay in Armenia if I was not justifiably optimistic. And we are no longer the Palestinians of the South Caucasus. We no longer never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Excellent. Before you start, we have a question from Mr. Novruzov, and I would very much ask if you are present in the audience or if you're watching this, could you rephrase your question? We would like to ask that, but not in the current wording. Thank you.
There's two missed opportunities, it is pity, for Turkey during the last 15 years. One is Cyprus, regarding the Annan Plan thing. You know, we were so close to a real sustainable solution, but it was rejected by the Greek Cypriots votes. But it is the fact of the life. The ballot was over there, but the Greek Cypriots didn't want such kind of a solution. And the second one is, I think, as I say, the normalization with Armenia. If you look at this normalization process with Armenia at that time, there were some factors which made it possible. The rising self-confidence of Turkey, which makes the government possible to take risks, some bold, international relations, some diplomatic decisions. Second, a good economy. The Turkish economy was booming. And a relatively secure atmosphere, just accept the Iraqi thing, a spring was with the Greeks, and good relations with Russia, and good relations with Syria, and with America. There are some new hopes with Mr. Obama, and all was bringing together, making it possible. And second, a common stance for any international problem, in international, commitment for us. The European Union, the Russians, the Americans, and the Minsk group, such a thing. And I don't think, we can see these parameters are right now ready for a normalization with Armenia. And regarding this, and you cannot underestimate the importance of Azerbaijan. It is not just an issue of Armenia and Turkey. I'm not just talking about, one nation, two states. Yes, these are romantic, to an extent, relatively true things, but at the end of the day, Azerbaijan is a very important strategic country for Turkey. Regarding the energy hub, regarding the energy roads, is a point to open to the Central Asia, and Turkey cannot disregard the Azerbaijan. Just I am keeping, the importance of the cultural and religious, whatever relations are staying over there, the personal relations with Mr. Aliyev and Mr. Erdogan. But at the end of the day, just forget about, the administrations. The reality is on the ground. The map is telling that Azerbaijan and Turkey should move together, and just forgetting Azerbaijan and just focusing on the Armenian-Turkish relations won't bring you further. But I really wish that even some region, some rayons in Nagorno-Karabakh will be left to Azerbaijan, and it can pave a way for a normalization. But now, at least with the current conditions, unfortunately, I'm not so optimistic about a new opening on Turkish-Armenian relations. But just a final thing, what brought, yes, it's a missed opportunity, but it made possible in Turkey to discuss about the Armenian genocide allegations, the rethink about it. I want to pay respect to late Hrant Dink. His death just paved a way in Turkey to think about the understanding the pains, and that's why we moved away. It's an important thing, but in real terms, I don't see an opportunity for a new opening. Thank you.
Excellent. We have a question from the audience, Your Excellency.
They can identify themselves.
Yeah, please identify yourself.
Thank you very much, Turkish ambassador. Of course, I would be amiss, I think, after so much references, but I will not be commenting on any of the speakers' words, entitled to your own views. Obviously, there are a lot which I would not agree, and a lot that I would agree. Now, on that, my question to the speakers are this. What do you think the EU, with its Eastern Partnership in this region, can do more in terms of security, hard security issues? And also, yes, Armenia doesn't share a border with Russia, but Russia is in Armenia. And also the Turkish-Russian relations, I must say, and Armenia and Georgia, I go back to what Osman said. In Urumia, not many people know, before the First World War, there was a time when the Armenian Dashnak, who became afterwards Dashnak, they took refuge in the Ottoman consulate from the Russians. And the Russians forced the Ottoman government then to give them back. One of the things that history teaches us, when you read it properly from many resources, that the Russians were most afraid of an independent Armenia at one stage in the history. And the Transcaucasian states, which last year, 100th year of independence, one of the first countries, and actually the Ottomans who were negotiating Batum and Trabzon, and afterwards the Republicans of Turkey, have backed the independence of these countries. And to this day, it's the President Erdogan, who some people may like, some people have criticism, nobody's above criticism, but you have to, as again Osman Bey said, see the Turkish foreign policy beyond the people. And it is beyond the people. And President Erdogan, for one, is the only, as far as I know, the Turkish leader who went up and said in the General Assembly of United Nations, who supported the territorial integrity of Georgia at a time when there was a rapprochement with Russia. The same thing goes for Ukraine, same thing goes for anything. Now, my question is, again, EU is a very important player here, which Turkey actually, despite its relations, complicated relations, and the history of relations with the EU, we do support the rapprochement and this integration processes of the Caucasian, all three South Caucasus states, including Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But is this only about to be economics and free travel? Like, for instance, Armenia doesn't have a visa-free agreement, yes, with the EU. Georgia has. Or will there be any security component? Because as NATO, and Turkey is a member of NATO, will be a member of NATO, and in Turkey has, like the other allies, its legitimate right to tell what it thinks it is right for the alliance. And we will be doing that. And whether our allies like it or not, and sometimes some allies, trust us, have worse in the negotiations. Now, we support Georgian membership to NATO, no problem with that. And actually, we are one of the forerunners of that support. But we want to see also, there's a distinction between NATO and EU. And European doesn't necessarily mean EU either. And about the values, there are certain values that are universal, like democracy. If your allies are giving refuge, asylum, to the officers who attempted a coup, next day, they go to that country with helicopters that were taken by our money. I have a problem with that, because we are preaching democracy to the candidates for NATO membership, right? So that's one issue. Values are universal. They're always challenged, and there are always balances. And it's not about only in the monopoly of anyone. So what happens with the EU, and how do you see the EU role in the South Caucasus, and how do you think it should be? My question is that. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellence. Before you gentlemen answer, there's another question from the audience. There's a lady who will bring you the mic.
Yes, thank you. The deputy of the Greek embassy. I would like just add something, that it is difficult for a European country to extradite 8 military officers when in the country that wants the extradition is the champion of journalists in jail. Just that.
Any more questions from the audience? Lady over there.
Thank you very much. Question to the panelists. Russia is really stepping up its military fortification of the Black Sea region. And what do you think about that? And we can also recall that it has been selling weapons constantly both to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and now there are important deals with Turkey coming up also. How do you see that in Black Sea context?
Excellent question. Could you identify yourself?
Eka Akobia, I'm from the academia, from Caucasus and Tbilisi State University.
Excellent, thank you. I think we better start answering them.
You want to go first, Osman? Oh, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the EU, I think it's so important for Turkish perspective, it's my personal view, the EU should be included to the international system as an important actor, because when the Americans are just having an isolationist policies or unpredictable policies, at least the EU is still predictable, because they are incapable to be unpredictable with the Commission decision-making process. But anyway, it is important for just getting the European Union into picture. For Turkey, yes, there's a problem with the EU itself, as an institution, as a membership process. If it is not, then one by one the European countries, the Turkish relations with Germany, with France, with some other important actors should be improved in order to pull them into the picture, in order to create a new balance in the region during the lack of United States, especially, for instance, the reconstruction of Syria. For instance, Turkey may be in cooperation with the European countries in order to, push a new Syria, whatever it is. And regarding, just not extraditing, the military personnel who were just have stolen Turkish helicopters and killed Turkish people and went to Greece, and you are not extraditing them because of journalists were jailed. No, it is not the case. It is not the case. I got it. Already there are so many military personnel participated in the coup attempt. They are in jail. They are being, the treatment is going over there. And now still the only, punishment will be imprisonment. And you are not giving the soldiers back to a NATO ally, we were supposing that these, anyway, I don't want to go into detail, but I'm not defending, what's happening to, I already mentioned regarding press freedom, regarding journalists in jails. I don't have any question about, but such a comparison doesn't work. And regarding Black Sea thing, the Russians are just widening their area of influence day by day. In Ukraine, in Crimea. Crimea is a very big loss for Turkey as well. And what we have seen what's happening, on the port over there, just they are taking the Ukrainian ships, whatever it is. And of course, just a stronger Russia will just affect the balances in the Black Sea region. And that's why, and this revisionist approach in the Russian, Sistema, I think Mr. Whitmore was telling that, and it is changing the balance, and Turkey is not so happy with it. It is something obvious for the stability of the region. Thank you.
And very briefly, if I may, the first question from the Turkish ambassador. The short answer, the clear answer is yes, of course. The European Union must do more in terms of beating the insecurity. But every speaker on every panel has an obligation to be honest and open. Therefore, I'm a former instructor for the U.S. Army Special Forces. From a military point of view, the European Union is simply not able and not ready, and realistically, not necessarily willing to fill the security vacuum. This is more the reality, despite the wishful thinking and ambition. Having said that, I'm also jealous. I'm jealous that the Greek and the Turkish diplomats are sitting next to each other. From an Armenian perspective, this is what we aspire to. We want diplomatic engagement, not just with Turkey. We want diplomatic engagement with Azerbaijan. We also want normalization of relations, where we need people-to-people contact. We need to visit Baku as well as Ankara and Istanbul. My point here is the European Union can meet softer security needs, encouraging and facilitating people-to-people contact and investing more in the foundation for an environment more conducive for when and if our political leaders find the statesmanship and courage to return to negotiations. The second question regarding Black Sea security is very important, especially because we see the over-militarization of this region as well as the Black Sea in a broader context. And for me, the real lesson here is who wins and who loses. Everyone loses except one country, Russia. Russia benefits from the status quo of occupation, the status quo of, in many ways, unresolved conflict. It's no accident that Russia is the #1 arms provider to both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And in many ways, engaging with Azerbaijan as well as Turkey, it's Russia that is also the obstacle, if not the elephant in the room. But more than that, I do think we have our own arsenal, an underestimated, underutilized element where our strongest weapon is actually democracy. From a Georgian perspective, read the works of Gianodia in terms of the importance of democracy in resiliency. And to be honest, Armenia is too small to fail. We are simply too small to fail in the sense that it doesn't take much and it doesn't take many for real change. And this change is already underway.
Excellent. If audience has any more questions, they're welcome to ask. Otherwise, we'll go to slides again. Anyone? So, since we were suffering with the dearth of Georgia coverage, so let's pick up the question on Georgia. In panel discussions, Mr. Giragosian mentioned about Georgia's role. I wish to ask a question. How do you see Georgia as a peace platform for unresolved, I suppose, regional conflicts, is what the person wanted to say? There you go.
Sure. I think Georgia has to be appreciated for being our host or hostess, giving us a platform for dialogue, for facilitating engagement. But I think Georgia, no matter who's in charge, whether it's the guy on the Hill or whether it's elected people, has to do more in terms of brokering, whether it's Armenia-Turkey, whether it's Armenia-Azerbaijan dialogue. It's no accident that next week I'm coming back to Tbilisi for a Track 2 effort with Azerbaijani friends and colleagues. Georgia, again, is the host or hostess. But I do think that Georgia can and should do more in this regard. But we also have a positive trend here, where we are now contributors and not just consumers of regional security. And now that Armenia is more of an island of democracy and has regained its position, Georgia too is much more of a partner for peace.
Excellent, and I think we'll close with one final question. It's again to you, and you mentioned that you're optimistic about Armenia. Is Armenia's bright future possible while Russia has leverage on Karabakh? And I think it could be tailored to Russia, to Georgia as well. Can our future be bright when somebody has a leverage on our occupied territories?
Yes, and here's why. Clearly, the first step to addressing a problem or a challenge is to recognize the problem and admit the challenge. In this context, whether it's Baku, Yerevan, or Stepanakert, there's a recognition that Russia is part of the problem and not the solution. And the real impetus, the imperative for engagement, lies in our own hands as neighbors, not necessarily playing to Moscow. For one practical, concrete example, the new Armenian Prime Minister is much less fearful of engaging President Aliyev directly, informally, at every opportunity, without necessarily flying to Vienna or Moscow or Sochi. In other words, in terms of dialogue over Nagorno-Karabakh, we shouldn't have the Minsk group as babysitters each time. International mediation is good, but not necessarily the key to moving forward. And I think whether it's a Georgian, Armenian, or Azerbaijani realization that Russia is very much opposed to such progress only demonstrates that the nostalgia for the Soviet Union, that the misplaced investment in Russia in this region is a dangerous mistake. But what's also important is the realization that Putin is not to blame for all of our problems. Putin is not responsible for our own mistakes and shortcomings, whether in corruption or lack of democracy. The European Union is not the answer to all of our problems, nor is NATO. It's an opportunity, it's a utility, but it really rests in local economics and politics and good government. And my G word here is good government. And going forward, again, I would stress Russia's operating from a position of weakness, not strength, insecurity, not confidence. What we need to prepare for, however, together, is a shared future, but also in preparation for what happens the day after Putin. This is a new challenge that we're ill-equipped to prepare for.
Excellent, and I think this concludes this session. Thanks to the speakers, excellent inputs. So a big thank you to organizers. Welcome, and I hope we did not delay the lunch too much. Enjoy. All the best.
Osman, teşekkürler. Thank you, sir. I tried to be brief. I hope I didn't go too lengthy with the answers.